Why are people afraid of the facts about Jews? I've met many different people, and I can say that there seems to be a general fear that arises in people when the facts about Jews come up. When I say facts about Jews, I mean pretty much things that there is overwhelming evidence against the Jews on. Bolshevism, for instance. There's no doubt that Bolshevism was a Jewish movement. Many people at the time knew it, and that includes people who were not necessarily enemies of the Jews. Winston Churchill, for instance, wrote an entire article on the Jews and communism, entitled Zionism versus Bolshevism, a struggle for the soul of the Jewish people. In this article, Churchill said very clearly, and I quote, "This movement among the Jews is not new. From the days of Spartacus Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx, and down to Trotsky in Russia, Bela Kun in Hungary, Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, and Emma Goldman in the United States, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development, of envious malevolence and impossible equality has been steadily growing." Churchill goes on to say, "There is no need to exaggerate the part played in the creation of Bolshevism and the actual bringing about of the Russian Revolution by these international and for the most part atheistical Jews. It is certainly a very great one. It probably outweighs all others. With the notable exception of Lenin, the majority of the leading figures are Jews." Of course, nowadays we know that Lenin was at least 1/4 Jewish, but obviously that wasn't well known at the time. He goes on to say, "Moreover, the principal inspiration and driving power comes from the Jewish leaders." It really can't be much clearer than that. He's pretty much saying that Jews created Bolshevism and that Bolshevism is a Jewish conspiracy which is created for the overthrow of civilization. And that's not Adolf Hitler saying that. That's not Father Coughlin saying that. That's not Henry Ford saying that. That's Winston Churchill. And of course, many Jews confirm this themselves, albeit very quietly. The Jewish World in London, April 16, 1919, page 11, said, "The Jews have been furnishing for the Bolsheviks the majority of their leaders." Anti-Semitism and the Jewish Question, in London, 1942, page 31, said, "Karl Marx, who came from an old family of rabbis and brilliant Talmudic scholars, was to point the path of victory for the proletariat." Rabbi Stephen Wise in the American Bulletin of May 15, 1935, said, "Some call it Marxism, I call it Judaism." Rabbi Wise was also a liaison for President Roosevelt and President Wilson. Harry Wotton, in A Program for the Jews and an Answer to All Anti-Semites, published in New York for the Committee of the Preservation of the Jews in 1939, page 143, states, "The communist soul is the soul of Judaism." The Menorah Journal in New York from July to September 1932, page 106, states, "It would be absurd to deny the intensity of the Jewish participation in the Russian revolutionary movement." The American Hebrew stated on September 10, 1920, that achievement, the Russian Revolution, destined to figure in history as the overshadowing result of the World War, was largely the outcome of Jewish thinking, of Jewish discontent, and of Jewish effort to reconstruct. Now that's very similar to what Churchill said, that this was a movement to overthrow and reconstitute society on the basis of arrested development. The Jewish Voice, published in New York from the National Council of Jewish Communists, January 1942, page 16, stated, "The Jewish people will never forget that the Soviet Union was the first country, and as yet the only country in the world in which anti-Semitism is a crime." It was punishable by death, by the way. The same source said in a year before, on page 23, "Anti-communism is anti-Semitism." I could go on. There's a whole library of quotes on this, but I think you get the point. You can look them up yourself if you want to see more of them. And if quotes aren't good enough for you, then I would just tell you to look up the people who actually pushed communism. Look at their biographies. Look at their family history. Leon Trotsky, real name Lev Bronstein, the son of wealthy Jewish wine producers. Also author of the book In Defense of Terrorism, which was a book that encouraged terror to be used against counter-revolutionaries. He was also founder and leader of the Red Army as well as the leader of the First People's Commissariat, along with 4 other revolutionaries, all of whom were also Jews. Karl Marx, author of the Communist Manifesto, real name Karl Mordecai, the son of Rabbi Herschel Mordecai. And you know Mordecai was the name of the Jewish hero in the Bible, in the Old Testament in the book of Esther, who helped undermine the Persian government, similarly to what the communists did to the Russian government and to the other Eastern European governments, and tried to do to Germany also, before they were stopped by Hitler. And those are just a few of the top Jews that were involved in it, but the list really goes on and on. This prompted many people, even in our own government, to take notice of the Jewish leadership and involvement in Bolshevism. David R. Francis, the U.S. ambassador to Russia in 1918, while he was in Russia, remarked, "The Bolshevik leaders here, most of whom are Jews and 90% of whom are returned exiles, care little for Russia or any other country, but are internationalists, and they are trying to start a worldwide social revolution." Right in line with what Churchill said. So there is no doubt, really, that Bolshevism was a Jewish movement, and you can come up with any excuse you want to try and excuse it, but the fact of the matter is it was a Jewish movement. Yet these facts are very difficult for some to stomach. For instance, many Christians I have run into blatantly disregard the facts about Jews, and tend to respond with a Bible verse supposedly proving that the Jews are some sort of special group of people that cannot be criticized or opposed in any way, even if the Jews are ruining the world.
There is a promise to those who bless Israel to be blessed, those who curse will be cursed.
I mean, you can give these people all the names, dates, writings, sources, anything you can find to prove the point that Jews were behind Bolshevism, and that the reason that the Bolshevik or communist or liberal culture, whatever you want to call it, still prevails in Western civilization is due to the fact that Jews still prevail in Western civilization. Yet just about every time I have made that point to a Christian, I get a relatively hostile response, along with a Bible verse or two, about how criticizing the Jews is an evil thing, even if the criticism is true. Now that is scary. But this seems to be a mindset that has become the norm throughout American Christianity. This nonsense that Jews cannot be criticized or named in any way, even when the evidence against them is overwhelming. I'm picking on Christians at the moment, but this type of mindset really does prevail throughout all American thinking, Christian and otherwise. And it's interesting to know that no one ever asks why this mindset continues to prevail in America and who is responsible for making it that way. We just don't ask those questions here in America. What a contrast that line of thinking is to the men who founded this republic. Thomas Jefferson said, "There's not a truth existing which I would fear or would wish unknown to the whole world." It's a shame that so many people in Jefferson's country don't feel that way. They believe that their ideology is more important than the facts. Or even worse, they tend to confuse their ideology as the facts. Well, I know this to be true because the Bible says so. No book, whether it is designated as holy or not, is above the facts. If the fact shows something contradictory to the Bible, then the Bible ought to be rejected as the ultimate source of truth. No one should ever feel intimidated by man or by deity to discuss the facts and inform people of them. In other words, we ought to be able to openly discuss the problems facing our nation and who is likely behind them and not feel intimidated to do so. Yet many Americans feel that they will anger their loving and caring God if they dare to point out or agree with some uncomfortable facts about God's favorite group of people. But I have to reiterate that no man or deity should be so controlling of us that he would keep us from reporting the facts, as uncomfortable or offensive as they might be. Truth is truth, regardless of who likes it or not. Now, the Jews don't believe that, of course. They believe that truth is defined as to what benefits Jews, and everything else is anti-Semitism, hate speech, racism, bigotry, xenophobia, etc. This is the mindset of the Jews. It has to be beneficial for them, or it cannot be allowed to be discussed openly and critically, even in a society which is founded on the very principle of freedom of speech and openness. For example, if the Federal Reserve is controlled by Jews, don't you think we ought to be able to say that the Federal Reserve is controlled by Jews? No one should feel intimidated or fearful of pointing out those facts, as uncomfortable as they might be for some. Yet that is not the case for many Americans, religious and otherwise. Now I realize that as of this day, the Jews cannot legally penalize an American citizen for simply reporting negative facts about them, although they would certainly like to, because of the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of speech, even speech that people don't like, and even speech that Jews don't like. But the Jews have found little ways to get around the First Amendment. For instance, if you post a video on YouTube or a similar site that merely points out some of the aforementioned facts about Jewish control of the Federal Reserve, you're likely to get one of these. We encourage free speech and defend everyone's right to express their points of view, even if unpopular. But YouTube does not permit hate speech. Hate speech means content that promotes hatred or violence against members of a protected group, race or ethnic origin, religion, disability, gender, age, veteran status, and sexual orientation, gender identity. Sometimes there is a fine line between what is and what is not considered hate speech. If you're not sure whether or not your content crosses the line, don't post it. Now, the term hate speech is subjective, even to the people who are pushing the term on us, and I can prove it to you. Mark Potok, the Jewish spokesman for the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a Jewish group, and by that I mean it is a group with a disproportionately large number of Jews in its hierarchy, said in an interview with CNN that there is no legal or shared definition of hate speech. Potok said, and I quote, "There is no legal meaning. It's just a phrase. Hate speech is in the ear of the beholder." Now that is interesting. If hate speech is in the ear of the beholder, and you can have an entire video removed from YouTube that points out some uncomfortable facts about Jews, then doesn't that tell us exactly whose ears are determining what hate speech is? And of course, this very personal definition of hate speech is pushed on the rest of us. So that's one of the little ways the Jews work to keep facts against them out of the public sphere. Censorship. There's also the intimidation factor. I've already shown how this works with religious people, but it's also valuable to know how this factor works on others who may not be religious or may not be as religious as those waiting for the rapture. In the United States, we are raised with a very infantile concept of good and evil. And this is generated primarily from two sources. One is church and the other is pop culture. In essence, television, movies, magazines, comic books, etc. If you're a secularist and you're not raised in a church, then you'll have your opinion formed for you by the pop culture, which also reinforces much of the good and evil nonsense that the religious people hear in church. The Star Wars movies are good examples of this. There's a very clear and distinct line of good and evil in those movies. The evil dark side is always trying to take over the universe and enslave everyone, and the light side, of course, is trying to heroically stop the dark side. There are many other examples of this too in American pop culture. And Americans, whether they are religious or not, grow up with this very infantile concept of the world embedded deep into their psyche. And when Americans are old enough to comprehend the real world around us, we start getting our prescription doses of political propaganda. Adolf Hitler, for instance, was not just a German leader who took on the New World Order of Bolshevism. Rather, he was an evil dictator of the dark side of humanity that wanted to take over the world and enslave everyone. And of course, the people who opposed him were heroic and courageous, God-fearing people going to war to help out their fellow man and to make sure that freedom and liberty prevailed and that the dark forces were defeated. And this theme is repeated over and over again on TV in America. So Adolf Hitler is Darth Vader in America. He's the boogeyman. And because Adolf Hitler is the evil boogeyman, the things he believed and said were also evil. Especially, of course, his opinions of Jews. Anyone who can be associated with Hitler or his beliefs faces quite a bit of adversity in America. First, you have to understand the programming factor, or the brainwashing factor, if you want to call it that. For instance, one of the rebuttals I hear the most often against the facts about Jews is something along the lines of, "Well, I agree with a lot of what you say until you start blaming Jews." In other words, the facts and their sources make no difference. Once someone hears the word Jew in a negative fashion, his brain immediately shuts down and his mouth takes over, and he simply starts repeating all the slogans he has heard on TV or in church. "Wow, you sound like Hitler," or "Don't you know that type of thinking led to the Holocaust?" Like I said, this Star Wars programming runs really deep into the American psyche. It's also a good measurement of knowledge and intelligence. If someone outright rejects the facts about Jews in this fashion, it is obvious that either A, he has not studied this subject and doesn't know the control the Jews truly have over America, example given, the Federal Reserve, or B, he has heard something he knows is a no-no and immediately retreats from it because he is simply not sharp enough to understand what a fact is. More often than not, it's probably a little of both. But either way, it's still a good method to determine whether you are speaking to someone who is smart and capable of critical thinking, who has done his homework, or if you're speaking with someone who just follows the crowds and repeats the slogans. To a slightly lesser extent, especially when dealing with people online, it can be also that the person who is not understanding the facts about the Jews simply doesn't want to admit that he is wrong and that his beliefs are based on him being misinformed. Quite often this is the case, especially when giving facts to someone who is very opinionated. They just can't look like they've been told or owned or whatever, so they just persist in their wrong opinion. I'll have a lot more on this topic in the future because it just goes beyond the scope of one video. But I would say in conclusion that the main reason people are afraid of discussing the Jews openly is probably all the propaganda and nonsense that they have allowed the Jews to build up in their heads. And couple that with all the screeching the Jews do when the topic is brought up, and you pretty much have the situation we have today in the United States, where the country is in a downward spiral, and only a handful of people have the spine to talk about who is doing it, and an even smaller handful that are actually doing something about it. So the goal for every person who wants to save Western civilization should be to shatter these artificial taboos and reintroduce the concept of openness and transparency into the public sphere. You're going to encounter legion after legion of opposition, of course, as Americans are far more influenced these days by ideology than facts. But once the main taboos are shattered, then the shattering of other taboos will follow, and civilization will once again start rising towards the light and out of the darkness where the enemy currently has us descending.